So today's buyer lesson is going to be on how to impress a seller. So we're going to be talking today about a few of the things that you can do as a buyer to actually impress a seller when you're doing that initial meeting. I think a lot of buyers get this wrong, and it actually causes them to miss out on deals that they probably had in the bag, just because they've really butcher, frankly, the initial introduction and song and dance of getting a client ready when they're talking to an initial seller. So we're going to talk about what to do and what not to do today. So some of the best practices that you can do is building a buyer resume. So on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is a real buyer resume that I redacted, obviously, that I got on a deal. And it really impressed me because the person obviously put their details in there. They gave an executive summary about themselves. So what was their professional background, why they were interested in the opportunity. Then what was really interesting is they put their financial background in there. So one of the things that buyers misunderstand is that sellers are terrified when they go to sell their business because they have no idea who you are. It's a very confidential process. They're kind of really exposing a lot about their business to the world that maybe they've never exposed before, other than their accountant knowing. When a buyer comes in, they're really concerned about whether you're actually qualified, if you're a tire kicker, if you're just kind of spying on their business. So having these details is so crucial and really helps people understand, especially on the seller side, if you're qualified. It also helps us as brokers or advisors because we can then confidently go, okay, you've done your homework, you've done that work. We know that you're likely going to move forward on this transaction. So a few things you don't want to do not point out how bad the seller is at operating their business in those initial meetings. I know sometimes it can be tempting, especially as a buyer, when you think about you're going to buy and then improve a particular business. It's just not a good idea. That may seem obvious, but I've had buyers write up long descriptions about why they're not buying the business and all the things that are wrong with the business, and or use it as a negotiating tactic. Like, oh yeah, you're doing all these things wrong. It's why your business isn't worth very much. Don't do that. It's just going to make the seller annoyed. This is their baby. It's basically like going to someone saying, hey, your baby's really ugly. I could make your baby better. I could parent your kid better. It's not going to work out well. So even if it's true in the process of buying a business, and if you do know that, just bake that into the offer you're initially going to make. And you can say things like, oh, I'm planning to invest a lot of money in the business. That's why I'm offering a lower price, just because I need to keep some capital reserved to grow the business, reinvest in a few areas, blah, 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 blah. When it comes to this is probably the biggest mistake I see with first-time buyers that differentiates experienced buyers from the rest, is understanding you're going to trust but verify the information you're getting. So one of the most common traits of a first-time buyer is they submit a non-disclosure agreement, and before they've really seen any details, they have a laundry list of super detailed questions that are typically reserved for much later in the process, so later stage. At the beginning, just trust everything that you have are being presented, because you'll get the opportunity to do sufficient due diligence. And so a more tangible example of that is, okay, if the business says they did X number of profit over the last 3 years, you don't need to ask for the general ledger of the business to look at every individual transaction to make sure that they're not inflating or deflating the profit or revenue. While you can definitely do that in due diligence, there's a certain point where if you lead with mistrust, the seller is not going to feel very good. They're going to feel like it sets the tone that you're just going to be problematic the whole time. Same with an advisor or broker, and you're going to get basically bumped out of the process over buyers who maybe are a bit more experienced that know that there's a time and order to this. So what you should start with is building a really good personal relationship with the seller above all else. So making sure that you're doing that above everything else is going to be the most important thing to do. Then the last thing you're going to want to do is your homework. You're going to want to show that you've actually researched the business. Like, one of the worst things is when you get into that initial meeting with a seller and it's clear you haven't read anything, like the buyer presentation. You're asking really basic questions that you could probably even find on the client's website. I'm like, oh, what services do you offer, and things like that. It just is a really bad look. So actually showcase that you've done the work. And when you are going to meet that initial seller, they're going to see that you're invested in the process. They're also going to get a bit more motivated to be invested in the process. Overall, it's going to make a big difference.